I can still remember the Christmas of 1977 like it was yesterday. It was the week of Christmas when a series of inexplicable events plagued my hometown of Plattsville, Kansas. Although I was 6 years old at the time, I was old enough to know that what was happening wasn't normal. Anyway, it all began in the early morning hours of December 20th, when Joe Miller, the town's drunk, was found dead in the front of Larry's Bar and Grill. At first, his death was ruled accidental until the mayor of Plattsville was found bound and naked in his basement. Fortunately for the mayor, though, he survived his harrowing ordeal. The next victim wasn't so lucky. Harry Burns, a manager for the local bank, was reported missing by his wife after he failed to show up for their annual Christmas party. His body was discovered the next day by Sue Jones, an employee of the bank. Someone or something had placed his body inside the vault. Several more deaths followed, and things got even weirder. Old Man Waters, 89, came forward to report a very tall humanoid-like creature lingering around his house. His claim was quickly dismissed. You see, Old Man Waters was suffering from dementia, so nobody took him seriously. Anyway, rumors began to fly about each of the victims' past misdeeds. It wasn't long before each of their crimes came to light, including Joe Miller's vehicular manslaughter charge and Harry Burns' embezzlement charge. Things started to get even weirder when the Robertsons across the street reported hearing somebody inside their basement. Upon investigation, though, they found no signs of a break-in. Anyway, it didn't take long before authorities made a connection between the murders. This was a relatively quiet town, and crime was virtually non-existent, so all of the things happening at once was no coincidence. To make matters worse, Mayor Burns, he is Harry Burns' older brother, decided to cancel the annual Christmas parade and implement an 8 o'clock curfew. So you could imagine just how disappointed everybody was. With nothing to do, my parents made me go to bed early with the promise of presents in the morning. Reluctantly, I headed to bed. With the anticipation of Santa's arrival the next morning, I immediately fell asleep. Around midnight, I was awoken by the sound of rustling downstairs. Thinking it was Santa, I sprung out of my bed and quickly ran downstairs, only to be greeted by this god-awful looking creature. This thing was massive with its long horns, and by God, it grinned at me, exposing razor-sharp teeth. I stood there frozen in place staring at this enormous creature, even peeing on myself because I was so scared. Anyways, this creature stood there staring at me, and it reached inside the bag that it was carrying, pulling out what looked like a human leg. It then proceeded to devour the leg, and I swear, I could hear the bones crunching as it finished it off. As a 6-year-old, watching this unfold in front of me was traumatizing, to say the least. After the creature was finished devouring the leg, it looked straight at me, then placed a finger on its lips, gesturing for me to keep quiet. Then, it flew up the chimney, which was physically impossible for something that size, and in an instant, the creature was gone, along with the strange events that plagued the town. That was 45 years ago. I'm 51, and now, a mother and a grandmother. Christmas is in a few weeks, and strange things have been happening in Plattsville again. I'm afraid the creature is coming back for me and my family, but I'll be ready for it. Everyone who lives, or has lived in the small town of Sparings, knows about the events of the early years of the 2000s. Nobody talks about it, as not to bring back the trauma for those who were directly involved, but everyone knows. Everyone in Sparings knows about Santa Claus. No, not the red-cheeked, round, jolly man from the movies and stories. Not that Santa Claus. The Santa Claus who brutally murdered 6 children and attempted to murder a 7th. The first year, it was December 25th, 2002. A child was discovered missing in the morning of Christmas, with a small gift-wrapped box on his bed. Inside, the police found a small, simple Christmas card that read, "Santa Claus is coming to town," with nothing else written in it. At first, no one really made a big deal about it. It was just some kid who had run away and had left a strange note. Then it happened again. 2003, Christmas Day. Another child goes missing, with the same package and same note on their bed in the morning. This is when people began to get worried, and the search got serious. Sparings isn't a large town. It has one main road that goes into and out of town, and is surrounded by a forest. Any of the children could be anywhere in the huge mass of trees, so obviously, that wasn't where the search was mainly focused. But absolutely nothing showed up. There was no sign of them. When Christmas came around the next year, many children slept with their parents. Many people were scared that their child would be next. That year, 2004, not one, but 2 children vanished. People panicked, and the search efforts tripled. People from nearby towns came over just to help, but it didn't matter. No one found them. Nobody found any sign of any of the children. This went on for 2 more years. Each year, at Christmas, a child would vanish without a trace. A small package with a store-bought card inside sitting on their bed. People would search for a few months before realizing that they wouldn't find anything. Police began patrolling the streets during the holiday season in Sparings. They would watch the houses just to make sure some psychopath wasn't breaking into a child's room. But that didn't help. Every year, someone disappeared just the same. Then came Christmas of 2007. I was lying in my bed, staring up at the ceiling, when I heard something from outside my room. Thump, thump, thump. Footsteps, getting closer and closer. I began to panic, realizing what was happening. Thump, thump, thump. In my fear and panic, I completely froze. I didn't know what to do. I was only 10 at the time. I had no idea what I was supposed to do in that situation. The kids at my school had already been spreading rumors about what this guy actually was. A ghost, a demon, a psychopath. The latter was what everyone believed. Thump, thump, thump. The footsteps were right outside my door. My heart was pounding in my chest so hard it felt like it was going to burst out. Slowly, ever so slowly, my bedroom door creaked open. Thump, thump, thump. A shadow crossed over the dim light coming from the hall as the man stepped into my room. Then, in one swift motion, the man took 2 steps towards me and covered my mouth with a cloth. After a second, everything went completely dark and completely silent. I woke up in almost complete darkness. There was a stench all around me, a stench that I would only later realize was the smell of death and decay. A single window across the room from me let a few rays of dim moonlight shine through the room. The small amount of light glistened off of meat hooks attached to the ceiling, from which hung shapes which I could barely make out of the edges of. My arms and legs were tied together, but I managed to use a nearby crate to stand up. My eyes were beginning to adjust to the dark, allowing me to make out the metal door nearby, with a small wired window at the top. I sat there, in the dark, for what seemed like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, with no sound other than my own heavy breathing. Eventually, I managed to tear the ropes holding me using the edges of the wooden crate. Then, there was a soft orange glow from the window on the metal door as the light behind it turned on. There was a soft click as the lock opened, and a metallic creaking and scraping sound as the door opened. A man's shadow, which wore a Santa hat, spread across the room as the light allowed me to see the true horror of the room I was in. All around me were chunks of meat, but not animal meat. I recognized a head sitting on the floor only a few feet away from where I was standing, for God knows how long. It was Susan Jolrin, one of the girls who had gone missing. There was a pool of dry blood around the dismembered head, and I immediately had to hold back the urge to throw up. The man, wearing a Santa hat and red suit, walked into the room and looked around. I held my breath, hoping he wouldn't see me. But then I had an idea. The door was still open. The crate that I was behind was only a few feet away from the door. The man was currently facing away from both me and the door. I sprinted for the door without thinking. I was out and into the open before the man turned and yelled at me. I didn't hear what he said though, because my heart was still battering so loud it drowned out everything but my breathing. I ran and ran through the woods, my legs burning, but I kept running. As the sun was beginning to rise over the trees, I reached the main road, which I recognized as the road that leads in and out of Sparings. Around noon, I made it back to my house. I cried and cried the entire way back, and didn't stop crying until my tear ducts were empty. Through my sobs, I managed to get out what had happened. My dad called the police while my mom comforted me with hugs. When the police arrived, I recounted my story again, this time slightly more calm. They left to where I said I thought the building was. The next day, the news had a story about it. My mom didn't let me see it at the time, but I have recently searched up the article and read it. Apparently, the building was an abandoned butcher's shop. Inside were mutilated corpses of every single child who had disappeared, some so rotten they could only be identified through their teeth. But that wasn't the worst part. In addition to all of that, all of the bodies had evidence of being eaten. Bite marks, flesh missing. The worst part of the whole thing was that after I ran, the man must have left. There was no sign of him anywhere near the building. That's what scares me most now. He could be anybody. Anybody. No one knew who he was. Maybe no one will ever know. He could be at your mall, just waiting, bidding his time. You might know him. You might be friends with a cannibalistic psychopath. There's no way to know, unless you just wait until Christmas Day. Then you'll know, just like I knew all those years ago. Perhaps I should start from the beginning. I was a little disgruntled when I was given an assignment in the village that's notorious for being Finland's most desolate place. Puulenka. Look it up. It is certainly not the location that comes to mind when people think of Christmas. Lapland is the popular tourist destination in Finland. I was sent to Puulenka with a cameraman to interview residents for a fluff piece about remote villages. I was a journalist from the sunny city of Los Angeles. The two places are worlds apart, and we were supposed to be there for a month, an entire month. Moreover, the month was December. I had to spend Christmas in the middle of nowhere. The year was 2005. I was a young woman. That's a good thing in the media industry. At first, however, it's a little rough. You have to do the stories that nobody wants to hear before you get to the big ones. Those first few weeks in Puulenka were tiresome. I was bored. My cameraman Steven was bored too. The residents I interviewed were boring too. We were staying at a small bed and breakfast. The couple running the establishment were actually very friendly. That's why my interview with them was so unexpectedly distressing. I've left out their names for legal reasons. It's nearly Christmas Day, I said. Are there any festivities planned? The village is so quiet. Oh, the husband said, yes, Christmas Day is celebrated, but it's also feared. Feared? What do you mean? I asked, smiling at what I assumed to either be a joke or a Finnish man's broken English. I think I should warn you to treat that day differently in this village, he said. Please, Heather, make sure you and Stephen are asleep before midnight on Christmas Day. Do not wake until 6 a.m. at the earliest. Why is that? I pressed, trembling. At this point, it was only the husband's new, sinister demeanor that gave me any cause for concern. As he spoke, his breath seemed to fill the air with an icy chill. His brown eyes, which had previously seemed to be so warm, were filled with a blackness that haunted me to my core. We do not stir between the hours of midnight and 6 a.m. on Christmas Day, he repeated. The wife sat there quietly. Her smile had rapidly departed her face. I wrapped up the interview and Stephen teased me relentlessly over the next few days. What do we think? Evil Santa? Krampus? Stephen inquired. Stop it, Stephen, I scolded. I'm not scared of anything supernatural. I'm scared of him. He seemed so friendly for the first few weeks. Did you see how cold and robotic he became? They're just superstitious people, Heather, Stephen said. We'll just have to party a little more quietly in our room when the clock strikes midnight, won't we? What? I replied, gasping. You're not going to disobey his rule. I don't want that creepy couple to come in here and hack us to pieces. Stephen smiled, wrapping his arms around me. He gave me a soft peck on the forehead. You've not gone off me, have you? He asked, affectionately booping my nose. Nope. For that to happen, I'd have to fancy you, I replied, grinning. He was an asshole, and there was no doubt about that, but Stephen did have a way of putting me at ease. Our fling didn't have any real depth, but I trusted the guy. I trusted that I was just being silly. There was nothing to fear. They were just a friendly, superstitious couple. Still, that night, I saw the old man's black, haunting eyes in my dreams. I wasn't fully convinced by Stephen's words, but I tried my best to move past the uncomfortable interview. The husband returned to his pleasant self over the coming days. Christmas Eve was actually surprisingly fun. The wife cooked a feast, as we were the only guests at the bed and breakfast, and 4 of us danced to festive music. I decided the frightening interview had been a misunderstanding. "Have you had enough to eat and drink?" the wife asked later in the evening. "Yeah, thanks," I replied. "The meal was delicious." "Thank you, dear. But it is now 9 p.m., she said. "We must all go to bed." Stephen snorted with laughter. "Careful, lady. I don't know you that well." I smacked him in the arm. "This is later than we usually retire on Christmas Eve. We have taken a risk to give you a pleasant evening. Now please, we must all go to sleep," the husband said curtly. "I thought you said midnight," Stephen replied, swinging his drink. "You must be asleep by midnight," the husband explained. "I have no doubt that 3 hours is more than enough time for you to drift off, but it is better to err on the side of caution." I shot Stephen a look. He knew my looks well. "Okay," Stephen drunkenly slurred, raising his hands. "You're the man. He giggled obnoxiously as we climbed the stairs to bed, and I apologized profusely to the couple. But they shrugged it off. They understood that Stephen was simply a little too inebriated. I felt guilty for previously being so creeped out by the husband. He had returned to his friendly self. In hindsight, I realized he was probably just relieved that we were going to bed early. "Don't be so sour," Stephen chuckled, hugging me from behind. I pushed him off, clambering into bed. "Wait, you're not seriously going to sleep, are you?" Stephen laughed, looking at his watch. "It's 9:14 p.m., Heather." "I'm respecting the run rule," I replied, tucking myself under the duvet. "Suit yourself," Stephen shrugged. "I'll just watch TV on the lowest volume and keep drinking." "Please get in bed," I requested. "I'm sure I'll pass out before midnight," he chuckled. "Don't worry. I won't get us into any trouble with the spooky owners." I don't remember falling asleep. What I do remember is waking up. That, in fact, is something I cannot forget. I opened my eyes. There was some sort of commotion outside the window. I checked the alarm on my bedside table. It was 4:07 a.m. I had woken up too early. I had a vision of the terrifying old man. I pictured him charging into our room and butchering us in bed for disobeying his one rule. "Stephen?" I whispered into the darkness. He wasn't in bed. He wasn't in the armchair in front of the small TV. He wasn't anywhere in the room. I heard footsteps outside. Snow was crunching beneath feet. There was a muffled voice. It sounded like screaming. I scrambled out of bed and ran to the window, tearing the curtains open, and saw something that still haunts my every waking and sleeping hour. Wading through the snow, an 8-foot-tall abomination left a trail from the front door of the bed and breakfast. It was a huge figure, unlike any earthly creature I'd ever seen. Its skin was black. I still don't know whether I was more horrified by this monstrosity, or the half-alive body of my cameraman that was dragging through the snow. Stephen would have been able to see me standing in the window, but his eyelids appeared to be sewn shut. I realized his mouth was also sewn shut, which explained the muffled screams. He was missing all 4 of his limbs, but there was not a spot of blood on him. It seemed his limbless torso also had its wounds nearly stitched up. The only mess he left behind was a yellow trail of urine. I clasped my hand to my mouth, futilely attempting to mute the sound of my tortured wail. It was no use. The creature stopped walking. Unclenching its right claw, the being dropped Stephen's near lifeless body into the snow. The demonic creature slowly turned around to look at the window. Perhaps it had not even heard me. Perhaps it had just sensed that, like Stephen, I was not in bed. I had broken the rule. The being's face was crimson red and floated in the center of its pitch-black head. The thing had no eyes, but I know it saw everything. It somehow sensed I was awake. The creature's mouth was stretched into a wide, toothy grin that curved from one side of its face to another. I unleashed a primal scream into the sweaty palm of my hand. My eyes swilled with tears as I stared into the featureless face of the thing I was sure would kill me. The being started to walk back towards the bed and breakfast. I leaped away from the curtains, tripping backwards over the bed. I needed to fall asleep, but I only had seconds to do so. Suddenly, I had an idea. It was a bad idea, but it was the only option. I knew how to make sure I wouldn't be awake when the creature reached my room. I had to knock myself out. I could have held my breath, but that would have taken too long. I heard the front door of the building open and close. There were heavy footsteps on the creaky floorboards on the downstairs hallway. I did a dangerous thing. Obviously, it's not something I'd advise anyone else to do. I could hear the stairs creaking. The creature was getting closer. My heart was pounding. I hoped I would pass out from fear. I backed away from the window to get a running start. Then, I sprinted towards it. At the last second, I lunged for the windowsill, ensuring that my head made contact with its sharp corner. When I woke up, it was morning. It worked. My crazy plan worked. I was still alive. I had an obscenely large lump on the side of my head, but I was alive. The bump didn't kill me, and the creature didn't kill me. I thought for a fleeting moment that the whole thing might have been a dream, but when I clambered to my feet, I received a horrifying confirmation of what had transpired during early hours of the morning. There was a trail through the snow. It was the width of a human body. It led far from the village and vanished beyond the visible horizon. Stephen was gone. "Merry Christmas!" The somber voice came from behind me. I turned to face the old man, who was standing in my open doorway. It was so many years ago, but I don't remember opening the door. Perhaps the creature entered my room. Perhaps it checked that I was not awake. I bought a bus ticket to Helsinki Airport. The old man said, "Just one?" I didn't say a word to the old couple. I left Stephen's things behind. I told our company that he went missing. There were search parties, police investigations, and so on. He was never found. 17 years later, I don't travel. I know I'm far away from Pulenka, but I still dream of that horrendous, red-faced creature. I fear Christmas, just as the old man did. I live in Los Angeles, but I still don't stay up past midnight on Christmas Day.